I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life. On this weekly podcast, topics, discussions, stories from our lives. The following podcast will attempt to give you some history and context to this latest world conflict.
Season 10, Chapter 10.
Israel at war. My initial question to myself was how to make sense of this latest conflict in Israel. I quickly realized that sense and war are usually incompatible terms. If in order for you to live the life that you want, someone else must die, then sense is eliminated, humanity doomed. The best we can hope for here is to understand how we got here. If you are Jewish, it is more likely that you grew up learning this history, being connected to the plight of your people. And I would say more so than any other faith or nationality. The history of Israelis and Palestinians goes back thousands of years and rises out of sharp religious disagreements. But when looking at this latest event, we needn't go back more than about 100 years. 100 years. And two opposing factions who lay claim to the same piece of land. Let's start with the Ottoman Empire. Who were they? An entire empire based on putting your feet up, as Seinfeld so famously said? The Ottoman Empire started as a group of Turkish tribes who managed to take over most of what we might call today Asia Minor, also with inroads into Europe and northern Africa. They had a good run, almost 600 years. Toward the end of their empire, their strongest partner was Germany. And when Germany was defeated in World War I, what remained of the Ottoman Empire was divvied up among the victors, including that small strip of land on the eastern Mediterranean where Arabs, Christians, and some Jews had lived generally in peace and harmony. At the end of the First World War, the British and the French divvied up most of the Middle East, with the British taking control of this particular area. They called it the British Mandate for Palestine. Two things had been happening at the same time. Arabs in the region were quickly distinguishing themselves as a special segment of ethnic Arabs, Palestinians, and their numbers grew. At the same time, early 20th century, a movement had been growing among Jews, especially in Eastern Europe. It was called Zionism. The basic tenet of Zionism is that Judaism is not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserves its own homeland. With growing anti-Semitism and persecution, many European Jews emigrated to this same piece of land, one which had historical significance for Jews as a nationality and religion. British authorities at first allowed this migration, but as numbers grew, conflicts arose between Palestinians and Jews. Britain eventually stopped the flow of these migrants, disallowing any further visas. But Jewish militant groups arose out of this, not only to battle the conflicting Arab groups, but also the British authority. Shortly thereafter, the rise of Nazism, World War II, and the almost unspeakable Holocaust. Hitler's Germany was defeated, but not before at least 6 million Jews were annihilated. Those who managed to escape were scattered throughout the world. Many, however, sought refuge in British Palestine. A sentiment grew even among Jews who had fled to the Americas and elsewhere. Wherever they had settled, this land on the eastern Mediterranean was their homeland. In 1947, the newly formed United Nations passed a ruling that would see British Palestine divided into two distinct states, Israel and Palestine. The city of Jerusalem would be designated as a special international zone, as it contained historically significant sites for not only Muslims and Jews, but Christians. The city today remains an important destination for those three faiths. The Brits accepted that UN plan. They no longer had any real control in the region. 1948, the official State of Israel was born. But Palestinians and many other surrounding Arab nations, themselves only recently obtaining their independence from English rule, saw this move as more colonial British interference. They declared war on Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict, 1948 and 49. Israel won that war and not only took western Jerusalem, but went outside of the borders suggested by the UN agreement. They had encroached on much of what was to be Palestine. Israel controlled all but this small strip of land, 25 miles long, 7.5 miles wide, that was known as the Gaza. At the time, that was controlled by Egypt to the south. The West Bank, west of the Jordan River, was controlled by Jordan. Jews and Arabs continued to move to that region. And we fast forward to 1967 and something called the Six-Day War, another Arab-Israeli conflict. At the end of the Six-Day War, Israel had not only seized control of Gaza and the West Bank, but the Golan Heights in the north, from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula to the south, as well as all of Jerusalem. This meant that Israel was in charge of governing all Palestinians, quite problematic for all sides. So yes, though one could say this was thousands of years in the making, it is 1967 and onward that most of us know as the conflict in the Middle East. You have to remember, it's important to note that this was 1967-68, Vietnam War, and the galvanizing of student and youth movements worldwide. This dovetailed perfectly with young Palestinians who looked to the rest of the world and said, we don't need a government or an army per se to retake what we feel is rightfully ours. Palestinian freedom fighters sprang up. Eventually, a leader emerged, Yasser Arafat, who solidified that movement. In 1974, Arafat was invited to and spoke to the United Nations, where he said to resounding applause that all the nation's peoples had to choose between a rifle or an olive branch. Though at first quite the radical, Arafat became the face and voice of a possible negotiated peace in the region. Instead of territory by war, perhaps an agreement for a recognized free Palestinian state. Pieces of the property, as it was before 1967. And this is not a comment on who Arafat may or may not have been, but he did become the face of a possible peaceful solution. A smaller, highly radical, militarized Palestinian movement in Jordan was crushed in 1970 in what became known as Black September. And what was left of the PLO was basically Arafat, his United Nations speech, and ongoing discussions. Arafat died in 2004 in a Paris hospital. To this day, cause of death remains a mystery. He is still considered a terrorist by Israel. In 1978, Jimmy Carter brokered the Camp David Accords, where Israel returned the Sinai to Egypt. Israel's Menachem Begin and Egypt's Anwar Sadat won the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. Sadat was assassinated in 1981, many believe partly because of this accord. Over the coming years, many Jews would continue to move onto land in Jerusalem as well as rural areas on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Often their housing and property were subsidized by the Israeli government. This occupation of land gave Palestinians even less hope that they would ever have a homeland in that region. By the early 1980s, the region saw its first major intifada. Intifada, the Arab word for uprising. The Israeli government responded by setting up walls, fences, blockades, checkpoints, leading to more frustration. Israeli raids and volleys into Lebanon also happened. They were considered necessary to battle other terrorist forces bent on the elimination of Jews. The Oslo Accords were brokered and signed in 1993, which created what we still know to this day as the Palestinian Authority. This gave Palestinians some right to govern themselves, but led to little change. As one expert put it, there seemed to be little interest in peace. The goal was to control the unrest as best possible. A few years after the Oslo Accords, Israeli PM Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated for his efforts. allegedly by far-right Israeli hardliners who wanted no deal for Palestine whatsoever. During that first intifada, many of the violent protesters organized into a group calling themselves Hamas. Their goal, not only a Palestinian state, but the elimination of Israel and the Jews. They hated Jews, but they also hated Arafat and the PLO. Some say Israel tolerated Hamas for that reason. Israel hated Arafat and the PLO, and Hamas was the enemy of our enemy. There was a second Camp David Accord in 2000. It did even less to stabilize the region. And there was a second, larger intifada that followed. By 2005, Israel chose to pull out of Gaza, but Hamas allegedly won an election over the Palestinian Authority and vowed to continue the war. Over the coming years, there were many Israeli attacks into Gaza. Hamas is not recognized as a government by many Western regions, including Canada and the U.S., and in fact are considered a terrorist group. And we shouldn't think of terrorists as a bunch of ragtag misfits living in mud huts with used rifles and slingshots. These are highly sophisticated, well-funded organizations. Since 2009, the politics of Israel itself has gone to the right. Some say the far right, under Benjamin Netanyahu. So now add political strife among Israelis to decades of ethnic and religious tension in the region. Despite this, most of the Arab nations seem to have made peace with Israel. However, far-right politics tends to lean toward nationalism, military might, and hardline low tolerance of anyone deemed to be an enemy. Some experts say this outward peaceful coexistence between Israel and Arab nations was Israel's way to control Iran. Many Arab nations are uncomfortable with the rise of Iran after the U.S. military pulled out of Iraq. The theory being that as long as someone is controlling Iran, that would limit the power of Hamas. That appears that it's not working. Add to that unrest in Syria and Yemen, the Middle East remains a powder keg. On October 7, 2023, the terrorist group Hamas attacked Israeli civilians, brutally killing hundreds and taking dozens hostage. The stories of their savagery are almost beyond comprehension. And it's not like we can just play war by the rules. Hey, this isn't paintball. But there are reported atrocities that go beyond any war. They have been and should be condemned not only by governments, but by individual citizens of the world. It is suspected that Hamas did have the backing of Iran. And now to Israel's north, out of Lebanon, another terrorist group, Hezbollah, may see Hamas's attack as good reason to launch their own offensive against Israel. It's interesting to me also that after over half a century of modern conflict, how many Jews and Palestinians are still interested in coexisting in this relatively small stretch of Mediterranean nation. I'm not saying that all the problems just vanished, or that all transgressions are forgiven on both sides, or that even history is forgotten, but it's there, a wish to coexist in peace. It's the extremists on both sides who have a great interest in continuing the conflict. The latest, most egregious villain, Hamas, who with their foreign backing have A, bitten off more than they can chew, and B, have done actually very little to the cause of the Palestinian people to ever claim a homeland. Some say Hamas has pushed back any progress dozens of years. But yet for many Palestinians, Hamas seems to be the only one exacting retribution on what they feel is many years of atrocities by the Israelis. It's like after years of negotiations and peace talks, Palestinians feel they have nothing to show for it. As awful as Hamas is, there is a segment of the Palestinian population that says, well, nobody else was doing anything, at least they are doing something. Oh, it's complicated, because with Israel responding, they could also potentially receive international condemnation for the way they respond. That exists, but I hope that most people in the world don't compare Hamas with Palestinians. As I said, it's the extremists on both sides who each want all or nothing that are contributing to a lack of resolution. 8 billion people on Earth, about 1/10% of human life lives in this area of Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. That's it. Yet for the last couple of weeks, this is all we've seen. Wall-to-wall, 24/7 coverage of the conflict. On a world map, this tiny little dot of land has been a massive focus. It is an important story. Is it our top story? Sure it is. But for CNN, CBC, and others, it's the only story. The only story? As if the war in Ukraine has stopped? As if inflation is over? As if Aboriginals in Australia aren't still fighting for greater human rights? As if Doug Ford is no longer being investigated by the RCMP? As if all the wildfires have suddenly been extinguished and climate change is resolved? As if the U.S. Congress is suddenly functioning? As if Afghanistan has been stabilized? As if Elon Musk has Twitter under control? As if the world is no longer turning except for the war in Israel. Terrorist groups used to have to pay for propaganda, but now Hamas have their own free infomercial channel. It's called CNN. Again, this is a big, important story, but it's not the only story. 8 billion people would like to know what's going on in their world, too. And I would understand if there was always something new to report in this conflict, but there isn't. So the news channels just show the same burnt-out car again. You know, it's a big staple of network war coverage, the burnt-out car. They show it again and again. They show the same man running with his crying child, the same piles of rubble, and it's the same politicians begging for airtime so that they can appear to come down on the right side of an issue. This is what passes for news these days. I repeat, it's a big story. It's very important. It's awful. It's to be condemned. But nothing but for 2 weeks? Wow! News networks should realize that this is far beyond news reporting. They're actually pouring gasoline on this fire. The only time network news stops covering Israel is to show you people whose biggest problem is psoriasis, or getting proper life insurance, or they need to lose 30 pounds, or get better dog food for their dog. Hey, we'll be right back with more pictures of burnt-out cars after this word from Nissan. I get it, the commercial model is probably the only way to be able to afford to deliver news, but then bring me the news. Don't pretend that you're saving the world by sticking with one story, when all you're really doing is trying to sell me some pizza snacks. You're not helping the world to sing in perfect harmony. You're trying to get the world to buy everyone a Coke. After the Second World War, there were about 100 countries on this planet. Today there are almost 200. It's doubled. You know, because in Czechoslovakia, the Czechs and the Slovakians each wanted their own national hockey team. And the Serbians wanted to make it clear that they were Serbians, not Croatians or Slovenians. And a bunch of countries did not want to be SSRs, including Ukraine, who is still fighting that fight. It seems the only country who wants to be a part of England is England, because Wales, Scotland, and the Irelands do not want a UK who wants nothing to do with an EU. Caledonia and the Basques would prefer not to be a part of Spain. If Quebec and Alberta had their druthers, they'd be on their own too. Texas and California think they're big enough to be countries. We have a South Sudan and a North Korea. Taiwan and Hong Kong don't want to be China. Why don't we just have 8 billion countries? Normally we take a side on these things, and of course in the worldview we differ. We think you should have a country of your own. And you, too, but not you, or you. Seems arbitrary, and often driven, of course, by economics. Who gets their own country? I don't know, let's decide. I'll tell you what side I've taken. I'm against division and war and murder, rape, violence, and extremism, especially extremism based on religion or nationality. Whoever invented race, religion, and nationality as a way to divide the human race against each other, nice job. It's working.
Later That Same Life is written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. Larry Fedoruk, 37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.